is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Daniel Hickey from that other university down south.
Go Hoosiers.
Yes. He's a professor in the learning sciences, and his work is framed in the context of design-based research and situated theories of cognition. And he has done a lot of work in the area of participatory assessment and motivation, and also exploring learning in new media contexts, e-learning, and things like that.
Video games.
And so today he's going to be talking about using digital badges for the assessment of learning and motivation, and it's going to be very exciting for us to hear him. Before I cede the floor to you, Dan, I do want to thank Associate Dean Jim Lehrman for co-sponsoring this talk with us and for providing all the goodies in the back there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. And thank you, Jim, and everyone. Thank you for coming. So yes, I'm Dan Hickey. I am in the Learning Sciences program at Indiana University, and I work at the Center for Research on Learning and Technology. The work I'm going to talk about today primarily has been sponsored by the MacArthur Foundation. The Digital Media and Learning is an initiative that MacArthur launched in 2007. Some of the work I'm going to talk about today was also sponsored by Google. This work is grounded in work that was primarily funded by the National Science Foundation, but also a little grant from one of those little seed grants from the Office of Vice President of Information Technology. So a little bit of background on me and how I got into this project. I'm trained as a psychometrician. I'm trained to measure stuff. I studied with Jim Pellegrino at Vanderbilt. My first paper was in the Journal of Learning and Individual Differences on dynamic spatial reasoning. So I took a postdoctoral fellowship at ETS at the Center for Performance Assessment, and this was in the mid-'90s, and something happened during that time that really sort of shaped my career and my beliefs and my goals. And that is that between the time I accepted that postdoc in 94 and the time I got there in 95, the entire reform movement of statewide assessment collapsed in the U.S. The center was designed to support it, and it allowed me to go off in a very different direction. I did not choose to work with Bob Misleave and his team on what became known as evidence center design, but I did work on a project called GenScope, which was the first of many really sort of innovative, cutting-edge, sort of computer-based modeling environment for learning genetics. And that pointed me towards a career, which is pretty much most of what I've done in my career, is work with leading-edge innovators who are developing technology and stay just a couple steps behind them, focusing on assessment issues. And what emerged in my work was, while I was at ETS, I really began looking more deeply at what was emerging as a sort of consensus of situated cognition, Jim Greeno's work, Gene Lave's work, Jim G's work. It really started going, wow, I can really, if I go that far, I'm not going to get in those arguments about how situated cognition is, but if I pretend it is, boy, it reveals some new solutions to some really enduring and vexing problems, like debates over intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, controversies over different assessment formats. And so that's what I've done in most of my career. This project is a little bit different. The project that I'm going to talk about today is rooted in digital badges. And so I got into this in part. I've been involved in it kind of from the beginning. I was on a project that Jim G ran at a MacArthur project called the 21st Century Assessment. It was more or less, let's think about completely different ways of doing assessment. And so I was on sabbatical on that project when Connie Yowell, who's the head of DML at MacArthur, asked me to do a couple of investigations for her. One was Race to the Top. So I called up everybody who I either knew or wanted to know who was then giving testimony to Congress about Race for the Top, and asked them essentially, is this going to work? This isn't going to fly? And pretty much they all said no. And all pointed to everybody else for the reasons of why it was going to fail. And I'm sorry to say it's actually much worse than I thought it was going to be. I think there's some serious problems with this Race to the Top and the consortium. The formative assessments aren't going very well. It's not looking good. But I'm not going to talk about that today. So the other investigation she had me do was I got to call the heads of all the major U.S. foundations or the program officers who funded work in assessment or funded work in education and asked them, what are you doing innovative in assessment? And the answer was nothing. Literally, I could find almost nothing. Very little innovation. Lots of innovative programs, but no innovation in assessment. And so 6 months later, Connie announced the Badges Initiative in 2011. So you should understand MacArthur's work in particular is really a fundamental response to the recognition of the problem that if we don't come up with innovative ways of thinking about recognizing and assessing learning, it's really going to constrain our ability to innovate learning more broadly. So I was involved from the very start. We had some nice conversations. We got the people from Purdue University together at a meeting in 2011. So I'm going to come back to the competition, but let me back up a little bit now and say, thanks to Purdue, most of you know what digital badges are, right? How many of you have earned? This is thrilling because I'm so used to having spent so much time. I was in Munich, and it's like, but we still don't understand why the badges. So, how many of you have earned digital badges? Where'd you earn yours?
Khan Academy.
Awesome.
Khan Academy.
Okay. Others? May I ask where?
Through our Purdue system and then Khan.
Okay. Did you push your badge out to your backpack, to the Mozilla backpack? Did you share it out with anyone?
I did. Yes.
Okay.
I think.
Okay.
I'm not sure about that.
That's fine. That's what I met with Kyle Bowen before this meeting. So, okay. So I will go ahead and do. I did include a kind of a. Let's just talk about badges first. So, fundamentally, they're web-enabled tokens of accomplishment. They're information. They're nothing more and they're nothing less. In fact, now, thanks to the Mozilla Open Badges infrastructure specifications, there are 8 fields of metadata and an image. That is all, in the end, a badge really is. What's important about them is that they can be accumulated internally or externally. You have your badges you earned at Purdue. You can push them out to a backpack. You can share them out over Facebook. You can share them with your friends quite readily. And you can share them over social network. If you want to share them over LinkedIn, you just have to post the URL. LinkedIn's the only one that doesn't want to play with us, which is really frustrating because MacArthur and LinkedIn are very good friends, and he won't play. Nobody knows why he's being so resistant, but that's the big holy grail. We were at a meeting in Chicago last week talking about it, and that's our 1-year goal for the next year is to get badges in LinkedIn. The really important thing about badges is they contain specific claims about learning. This is why badges are different than grades and credentials. They contain specific claims about learning, and they contain evidence to support that claim. Most importantly, they contain links to more evidence. So the important thing about badges when done right is that the badge itself, rather than the credibility of the institution that issued the badge itself has evidence that you can interrogate to see if it's credible. If a student attaches the artifact that they produced, a portfolio, a paper, a rubric, a syllabus, the sky's kind of the limit into what information you can put in the badge. And what I'd like to argue today is that is a game changer. That is a fundamentally different way of thinking about recognizing learning. I'll give you a couple of examples. The first one is Digital Me is a really cool collective, kind of a Mozilla-type operation in the UK. Badge UK is a big push. There's been a bunch of these pushes. Chicago Summer of Learning was one. It's a big effort to recognize informal learning, and badges are really well suited for this. And Make Waves and Supporter to Reporters Medals was one of the awardees in the project I'll be talking about later. They received funds. So S2R is it's essentially a website, but it's really a social ecosystem that's trying to take young sports enthusiasts, fans, right, they call soccer, or supporters, and make them into reporters. And what they really say is, we're trying to make them reporters instead of letting them turn into soccer hooligans, right? And it's tremendously successful. This is the homepage of it. Great integration with the schools. Right, so this is the teacher headquarters. So if your student shows up and says, "Can I get a grade for this? Can I include this in my English class?" There's this resource here to help them. So if we take a look, I can zoom in here. Let me go ahead, and it's easiest if I just go ahead and go to the site. So this is Glenn Wheeler. He's an active, one of their sort of stars. This is Glenn's page, and there you can see Over there on the left are his badges. You can see he's got 4 of these. He's got a total of 13 badges. He's got 55 friends. These are all of his stories that he's reported. So let's just take a look at these badges. So that's what when people say, what does a badge look like? That's what a badge looks like. What I just did was I clicked on the badge, the image of the badge, and it opened it up to the evidence page. And the important thing is right here. This is actually a little slim on the data. There's more fields that they're not using. But the important thing is that link right there, because when you click on it, it takes you to the thing that he created that got him this badge. It's an interview with, I'll just let Hannah speak for herself. So, right away you go, okay, some pretty decent production qualities. This is not a little tossed off thing, right? That did not happen last night. I didn't know what the problem was with there, but there was some. That's weird. Well, anyways, it's a very inspiring interview, a very well done for a high school person, a very well done interview of a wheelchair athlete, the world champion wheelchair athlete. It's very inspirational, and you can see and it said how many. It had 8 likes on it, no comments, but that's the evidence in support of that badge. That's what I mean by it contains the evidence. So nobody's saying, who is this organization? What's this Make Waves? Who are these people? No, they're looking at the evidence itself. And that's a really different way to think about learning. Let me give you a second example. I got a little grant from Google this year. They have Google Course Builder as their Open Ed platform, which is about to be merged, by the way, with Open edX. You'll hear about it. It's going to trump a lot of other open learning platforms. But they offered grants to faculty who are willing to take an existing course, offer it as an open course, and make it more interactive than typical MOOCs are. And I said, I think I can do that, because I've been teaching P540, which is your basic ed psych, learning and cognition, and educational assessment. I've been teaching both of those courses for over a decade, and I've been teaching them online for 5 years. Every year I teach each of those courses at least once. And I've been just iterating the heck out of it and really refining this my own approach to personalized learning. There's a lot of focus on personalized learning, and mine is a very situated, personalized approach. Students, so in my book, I'll just give a little bit of overview. Every student has to define some sort of their own curricular aim. Right, to register for my course, you had to generate a curricular aim to use in the first assignment. Right, so that telegraphs to students, you're going to learn in a different way in this course. You're going to learn about validity and reliability by saying, for this curricular aim and for those assessments I developed for that aim in the first unit in the first part of the course, which kind of validity is criterion validity more relevant than content validity? Getting teachers to go, oh God, when I'm a teacher, content validity is a lot more important. But wait, if I'm going to be an administrator, then I think isn't criterion-related aspects of validity more important? Getting that kind of intellectual engagement happening and then fostering interaction among students, that's what my course is about. And it's working pretty well. Back to badges. The students, when they generate their curricular aim and describe their actual or aspirational role, I group them into networking groups, which they work in throughout the course. This is not individualized learning. It's asynchronous learning, but I've been calling it semi-synchronous because there are strict weekly deadlines that the students have to work towards. There is a textbook. I've been using Popham's textbook now for, I've been using it since the 3rd edition, and now it's at the 7th edition. You can earn 3 badges there's 3 practices badges. So if you complete 4 Wikifolios and get 80% on the quiz, you will get an assessment expertise badge for practices, principles, and policies. If you get all 3 of those badges and get 80% on the final exam, you get an assessment expert badge, which we will customize and say, you can ask us what state you want to say you were an assessment expert in, whatever you put on there. We're going to say, you may represent yourself as an expert, as is reasonable with one graduate level course. Cool thing is that the students who get the most endorsement or promotions from their classmates in each networking group also can earn a leader badge. This is a competitively awarded badge, and I'm telling you, it's competitive. They're really into getting these badges. So the easiest thing for me to do is just take you to class. I do have 8 students who decided to enroll in this course for credit. So the students who take the course for the actual credit, I set up a 4-credit course, they're required to complete all of the assignment, not just the required parts, but the optional parts. And this is my new Wikifolio. These used to be just open forms, but my programmer built these really sexy little sites so that the instructions come and go. I can embed links. So each week they reiterate their context. They say, okay, now this unit is on standardized testing. So let's think about what does standardized testing mean to you? So say a little bit more about yourself. So each week they rethink. So this is a core situative principle of learning, that they're constructing their understanding of their professional context alongside their understanding of these new concepts. And that's a really key thing in my work. So they go through and they do this thing. He also built us this groovy thing, this ranking thing. So what students do is they go in and identify a test that's important to them. In this case, Richard's in the military, so he uses the primary language test. So he goes through the test interpretation guide that's important to him and answers the question, which of these 3 common ways of interpreting tests, standardized test scores, which are detailed in the textbook, is most relevant to you in your role? And the cool thing is that, Thomas, these are drag and drops, and so this data is automatically accumulated. So when we feed it back, we say the administrators significantly said that percentile scores were more relevant than grade level scores. So we're able to foster broad discourse for the whole community. But this is not a talk about the poop. Here's the important part of this. And here you see, this is 1 week's test. Now this is a 4-credit student, so he's doing a little more work than the other students, but this is not unusual by any means. What you see there is that, so I admitted 400 students. We currently have about 80. Even that's just an overwhelming, crushing load if it were up to me to go in and evaluate all of them. But more importantly, when you evaluate student artifacts directly, you completely deform the interaction that can happen, and you get the phenomenon that I describe as, is this what you want? Everybody know what I'm talking about? When you grade artifacts, all of the interaction around them is whether or not you give everybody all their points. And if you didn't give them all their points, it's because you didn't tell them to put it in there, so you have to tell them to put it in there. It's a mess. We got out of it completely. So this is entirely peer endorsed. It's not peer assessed. All you do is click that button to say, yeah, I think it's complete. Or it's completed with the optional elements. Out of 600 of these, we found about 3 of them that weren't complete, that had been endorsed by peers, and about 8 of them that were 6 of them that were complete that didn't get an endorsement. We just tell them, no, you have to endorse 3 or more. But then they're allowed 1 and only 1 tag as exemplary. And they have to give the reason for it, what they thought was exemplary about it. And that's what we use to offer those leader badges, is that the person in each networking group who gets the most of those leader badges gets this other badge. So, now the cool thing about OBI badges, that's what they look like. That's what a badge looks like. That's what my badge is. That's my badge that I earned. I didn't finish all the assignments, by the way. When I push it out to Facebook, that's what appears. And if somebody clicks on that badge, this is what they see. And what you see is it says what I did. It says I got 80%, I engaged with peers, not included in links below. And when you click on these things, they open up the completed assignment. Right? That thing I was just showing you, they see that. So a teacher, for example, some of our teachers are having a hard time keeping up, and they're saying, I'm not sure if I can make it all the way to the end. Well, they can take this badge. If they want to say that they spent 5 hours a week, they email that to their supervisor. Their supervisor can see, many of them, it'll say like 8 comments, 4 endorsements. Here's the thing, that's pretty compelling evidence. We've had some interesting things happen. The student said, oh my God, if I had known that the actual thing was in the badge, I wouldn't have said those things about my supervisor on my badge. So we've actually added a new button that allows them to choose to include it or not include it. 1 click, I can send it out to Facebook. 1 click, I can email it to somebody. 1 click, I can put it in my Mozilla backpack alongside the other badges that I've earned. This is a cool comment. This is one of the students who earned one of the leader badges. She posted this, unbeknownst to me, she put it up as a comment on my blog on the 29th. She says, I immediately, because I blog about the course, I immediately shared it with my family members, and in particular those who are educators. 2 days later, she claimed she had to do it in order to keep up with me. That's kind of cool. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to make this kind of stuff happen. It's really hard to make this kind of stuff happen around learning, and real learning. I mean, my class is not easy. This is not an easy class by any means. It's a lot of work to get through the assignments. And the people who earn the badges, they know a thing or two. And the ones who drop out know less. So they know, like we're struggling, the midterm, the second exam, it's open book. We got a few students with like 75 second language learners, and we decided, no, just give it to them. Just take out the part that says they passed the test. Mostly want to keep the numbers up. I mean, it would look bad if I called it a big open online course, and if we got down into the 30 or 40, we'd have to call it a large open online course or something. So that's 2 examples of badges. And now I want to talk about the project that I'm working on for MacArthur. But before I do, are there any questions? Yes?
Where does the evidence reside?
On my server.
And so you essentially control your own evidence, or are you controlling the evidence for anyone?
Boy, we've had 2 research phone calls about this very specific issue, and I met with Kyle Bowen before I came. This is a huge issue about the longevity of the evidence. How permanent are they? One of the metadata fields in Mozilla's OBI is the expiration date of the badge. In my case, they live on my server, and it's up to me to keep that data accessible. Huge issue. Kind of not my problem in a way. That's Mozilla's. Mozilla's working on that, but there's a whole task force devoted to just that issue, and it's a big problem. People change their email addresses; they can't access their badges. So, Kyle is out in front of everybody on this thing. By the way, I don't know if y'all have been paying attention, but he's so far out in front of dealing with those kinds of issues, and because he only has to deal with it at the Purdue level. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how it goes.
So I was interested how you're going to use badges with a large course like this, and you're showing how you're having the students evaluate but not assess themselves. But can you explain, are you still having to go in and assess to award those badges to make sure that they are evaluated? You mentioned there were a few number that didn't evaluate that you didn't award to.
In fact, we're offering an instructor-verified certificate because the school systems don't understand badges. Like, what they want people to do is scan the certificate and upload it. So we've told them that they can also earn this instructor-verified certificate. In that case, frankly, my intern just goes in and scans it and makes sure it's complete. But I've been using this format. I don't want to go down this path, but the other thing I've been doing in my smaller courses is, even in my smaller courses, I don't grade the artifacts. That's like a core principle in my participatory assessment model. I grade the reflections. There's 3 very carefully structured reflections. If somebody can articulate what they're going to do differently in their context because of what they learned that week, in other words, engage in consequential reflection, Melissa Grisalfi's work, if someone can reflect critically, can they say, when a math teacher can say, it's portfolio assessment's really tough in math, and I really wish, if I was going to really learn about portfolio assessment, it was a lot easier for the English teachers. That person's learned something pretty fundamental about the concept. And then collaborative reflection, who helped you learn? In my case, in my regular online courses, that's what I grade. And if that's complete and coherent, they get their points. So that it's, I can do a month's worth of grading in a couple hours. So, we're very engaged in this issue of portfolio assessment and alternatives. And yes, Ellen?
I'm not sure I understood you correctly, but each person enrolled in these courses has to commit to reviewing somebody else?
The assignment, the specific assignment you are instructed to, and whether they do it or not, we're monitoring it, but there's no penalty associated with it. The instructions say endorse at least 3 of your classmates' Wikifolios for being complete.
So that's actually my follow-up. Just I wanted to be sure that I understood sort of the ground rules. So what happens when some Wikifolios are just more interesting or more attractive than others? Sort of the cluster effect that everybody evaluates these things that they think are cool.
They get a badge. They get rewarded. There's an incentive for them to.
But there might be someone who's done something really neat, but just others don't know to look at it? What happens to that person?
I could go on. What I do is the early posters. This is a completely different talk. The people who post first, like we get a ping and say they're typically the very ambitious students. So I go in and give weekly feedback to the early posters and send that out to everybody and put up an announcement and say, hey, if you haven't started yet, go and look at the comments that we provided to blah, 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 and blah. One of the things that I have learned over the years is that is the perfect place to embed more advanced concepts and ideas. If you put the advanced stuff, this week we're doing evaluating instruction. So we're getting into value-added modeling. We're getting into teachers evaluating their own instruction. And it raises some incredibly complex issues. If you put those issues in the assignment, you're going to overwhelm the less experienced students. What I'm finding much more effective is in the commenting themselves, I go in and give very detailed explanations, and then other students won't encounter that more abstract and difficult stuff until they're at that point. And then all of a sudden they have enough experience with the assignment to begin making sense of it. And frankly, if they can't make sense of it, it's fine. It's advanced, right? So we're able to accommodate a really wide range of ability using this particular format. But again, that's a totally different talk. Yes, David?
Is there a forum within this where students can have live chat or discussion?
Nope.
Okay.
I just don't. Synchronous stuff is just too complicated and too messy. They're starting to ask for it, though, and I'm starting to think about it. I don't even have a discussion forum in this one. In my regular classes, there's just a place to post questions. In my regular classes, we don't do any substantive learning in the discussion forum. It all happens on the Wikifolios. And it's a bit of a problem because some of the stuff is buried, and I think that's partly what you were getting at. So, again, that's a whole other talk. We're working on that. So my primary project now is called the Design Principles Documentation Project. In 2011, Arnie Duncan kicked off announced the Badges for Lifelong Learning initiative. It happens that Arnie Duncan is from Chicago, where MacArthur is, which was a helpful connection for getting this thing off the ground. I got a lot of publicity. I don't know if you saw tons of press. Chronicle of Higher Ed. I mean, it got a lot of press. They know how to do this right. They got 600 proposals to develop badge content, 600 very diverse proposals. In the end, they supported 3 platforms, and they did this whole complicated matchmaking thing. In the end, 30 organizations were given $100 to $200, maybe $300,000 to develop digital badge systems. My team and I have been asked to study these 30 projects to figure out what insights about using digital badges are going to emerge as these 30 very different projects try to figure out how to do something that nobody really knows how to do. So this is my team. I'm very proud of them. Rebecca Ito is one of my doctoral students. Katarina Schenk and Kathy Tran both work for Marianne Conley at UCI, and I lost one of my graduate students, dropped out of graduate school for personal reasons, and it's like one of those times you go, it's okay, this is going to work out fine. I said, I need to find an advisory board member, maybe somebody who's got some graduate students who want to work on the project. They both have NSF fellowships, and they've been very committed. They're heading up the motivation strand and doing a fabulous job. Nate Otto lives in Oregon, and Christine Chow lives in California. I've actually never met Nate or Christine. They both work. I had a project meeting with them this afternoon with a totally virtual team. I'm blessed to be working with Haystack, which is the Humanity, Arts, Science, and Technology Collaboratory at Duke University. Cheryl Grant in particular, just stellar people. And then the Mozilla Foundation. I just can't say enough about how lucky I am to have been stuck in the middle of this project with these two amazing groups of collaborators. The way it shook out was that I was asked to do a 2-year project to look at the knowledge that emerged across these 30 awardees, one of which was the S2R medals, which you saw. Haystack was responsible for actually supporting those projects doing their work. Much larger grant, much more exhausting work. Mozilla is responsible for everybody else. So there's all of these, they call them the unfunded winners, the other people who didn't get grants, but all these people are coming out of the woodworks who want to use badges. If you're interested, the Mozilla Open community calls are indeed open. These people know how to do open collaboration. There's an open phone call, anybody can join. log onto the Etherpad, and there's 30 or 40 people every week who join 3 or 4 different webinars and calls that Mozilla sponsors. Just awesome people. Those are the awardees. You can see it's a pretty diverse group. You see some very traditional ones, Girl Scouts, 4-H, right? Badges and ribbons. They've been doing this for a long time. There you see Make Waves up there, StoryCorps, Road Trip Nation. So these all look like you'd think that StoryCorps badges and supporter to reporter medals would have a lot in common. It turns out they don't. They're really very, very different projects. And so a lot of inspiration for my project comes from, so Carla Casilli, and I'm going to talk about her quite a bit today. Carla put this in one of her blog posts. Regardless of where you start, it's likely you will end up somewhere other than your intended destination. That's okay. Systems are living things, and your system needs to be flexible. You need to embrace a bit of chaos in its design. And it has been chaotic for these projects. For very interesting reasons. The Girl Scouts never really thought what those badges meant. So what we're finding is that the more formal institutions, the act of having to agree on what claims to put in the badge, what evidence to support those claims, and what assessments to generate those claims is a disruptive process. And many of them have failed. We're saying now it's likely that half of the 30 projects probably won't succeed in terms of issuing meaningful badges. They just can't manage that process. It's turning some of them inside out. Some of it's like, well, no, if you're at the 4-H and you have a federal program officer in the Department of Agriculture who thinks she knows a lot about learning and wants to tell you how to do the project, you're going to have some problems. My job is to turn that into a design principle. I'm not sure how I'm going to do that. The other inspiration for my project comes from someone who I don't know, but whose work I followed, Philippe Crutchin. He studies learning in designing complex software architecture. Right? If you think about designing really complex websites and software programs, really sophisticated stuff, millions of dollars, most of the knowledge generating when designing complex systems evaporates as features evolve and teams dissolve. Most of these 30 projects who were funded said they were going to do peer learning, peer assessment. Turns out when you have stakes attached to things, peer assessment's a pretty hard thing to do. Most of them aren't doing peer assessment anymore. That's pretty useful knowledge. And it's useful to know of the projects that did do peer assessment, what are the features of their project context that made it possible. So that's what I'm trying to do in my project, is essentially vacuum up this knowledge before it disappears. We're doing interviews, the third round of interviews now, and people don't remember what they were thinking 2 years earlier. This is an overview of my methods. We reviewed the proposals to identify their intended practices, and then we interviewed them after they got underway to identify their enacted practices. That's what you thought you were going to do when you had no idea what digital badges were. Now that you have a sense of what they are, what are you going to do? We're linking those to relevant research. We're just begun this round of formal interviews looking for the formal practices. What's going to live on after the money's gone? We're creating working examples. We're going to write and publish reports. I'm going to go back through these things. So this is where my assessment work was really helpful. I've been arguing for quite a few years now that the Black and Willem and Pellegrino and Al, their emphasis on assessment purposes is a little problematic. From a situative perspective, it's kind of silly to focus on your purposes, because to say that an assessment has a formative purpose, well, it's formative for somebody, but it's probably summative for somebody else. So I've extended that argument here by saying, what are the functions of your badges? So first and foremost, badges are they're a credential. They're a means of recognizing learning. Once you've decided you're going to recognize some learning, you usually have to have some sort of an assessment to generate the evidence that's going to support that recognition. Once you have created a recognition and assessment ecosystem, you're messing with motivation whether you know it or not. And how you're messing with motivation probably depends on how you think about motivation. So it's starting to get a little complicated here. And all of those factors in turn impact how you can study learning. So this was the organizing structure for our project. Somebody's trying to convince me to add another category. I'm not sure I'm going to change. But that's discovering learning. One of the big things about badges is you can discover opportunities to learn in ways you couldn't before. like those Facebook things, like your friends post something to Facebook. I spent $4,000 advertising my open course on Facebook. Compared to those badges being pushed out to people's friends, I don't need to do that anymore. That's a really good way for me to discover people who want my learning, and for people who want learning to discover me. So this is this distinction. So you have your intended practices that were outlined, what they envisioned at the beginning, then the enacted practices. And this gets at why I am a situative theorist, because it's really important. It's not right to say implemented practices, because that implies a different kind of thing. When you say enacted, what you're invoking is the importance of thinking about how did the context in which that practice, those intentions were enacted, shape that practice. So we're really focusing on what are the features of the project context that changed what people wanted to do and how they did. So that's the kind of information we're trying to gather. And then the formal practice is, what somebody's doing when the money set aside specifically for badges is gone. There aren't going to be any formal badging practices in Girl Scouts. They just couldn't do it. They couldn't get it together. And my argument here is that says something about the people who could. It says something about the credibility of the evidence and the badges of the people who did get it together. The fact that a lot of organizations were unable. It's not hard to issue badges. You can just walk to one of several sites now and type in some information and issue a badge. So why did Girl Scouts fail? Or why are they failing? So the emergence. So I want to make an important distinction between practices and principles. The previous slide were practices that projects were doing. They're not systematically designing principles, they're systematically designing badging practices. So they're being systematic, but they're not being systematic at the level of the general principles. That's my job, is to look across all of them and figure out what principles can we derive from what these people are doing. So the initial principles, we took the enacted practices in the projects, and we literally did a card sort. We put them on the table and clustered them into groups to figure out what are the more general principles that then can be embodied in the examples in those individual projects. And that's these general principles. The really exciting thing and the really fun thing we're immersed in right now is there's no research on digital badges. There's one peer-reviewed article with OBI-compliant digital badges currently in publication right now. But there's a lot of relevant research out there. I know an awful lot about portfolio assessment. And what my job is to take this principle, which was indeed one of the principles that emerged, was around portfolio assessment, and find the research that's relevant to that principle so that and put it someplace so that when people who are coming to this innovation can get access to that information. So this connecting, and that information might be a blog post. It might be the name of so somebody from a museum contacted me the other day and wants us to help them implement badges for their practicum. 2 of our projects were museums, so we can put this in. Not only do we have the principles to share with them, but when they start getting into those principles, we've also got links to relevant research that they can use, and when they get to the point that they need that information, they'll know where to find it. So this is our primary results right now. What you see here is ordered by prevalence. You see the 9 principles, what emerged from the process I just described. Use badges to map learning trajectories is the very first one. No big surprise though, that's a big function of badges. As you saw, it's really easy to communicate to learners what they're doing in my class by saying, there's 3 badges here. Assessment practices, principles, and policies. And each of those have 4 assignments associated with them. Well, so a lot of people are getting much, much more sophisticated, very elaborate, complicated sequences and stuff. And so badges are really good at that. Many of the projects are aligning badges to standards, so using the badge to sort of connect informal learning to external standards, blah, blah, blah. Right, I could go through all of these, but I won't. These were the assessment ones. Again, these are ordered by prevalence. You see use performance assessment at 4 and use e-portfolios at number 5. So about a half of the projects explicated performance assessments. I'm skipping over those things on the bottom right. I'm going to come back to those, but this is what's behind it all. There you see that previous information broken down in much more detail. What you see is, in fact, use leveled badge systems. There are 3 sub-principles that we identified clustering this stuff. 10 of the projects, leveled badge systems, were based on competency levels, whereas 8 of the projects use this notion of meta badges to do this leveling thing. So this is pretty valuable information, especially when it's linked back to the examples that we can show. So if somebody's struggling with an issue, we can share this information with them. So notice the shift there. Principles for motivating learning, ordered coherently, because identifying the principles for motivation is not as straightforward. What is a motivational principle is actually much more dependent on what motivation means to you, what your underlying theory of motivation is. So, but a very interesting one to work on. It's a lot fuzzier, right? So provide privileges. Not all of the projects associated them with privileges, but so this is getting us into this just nagging issue over extrinsic incentives, the debates and stuff that have been going on. So we're having a lot of fun with this one. This is each of those previous strands is led by one of the doctoral students, and this is the strand that I'm leading. One of the things that people are just beginning to wrap their heads around is the fact that badges contain information. And that information is fundamentally more meaningful if you're interested in learning than almost any other information out there. I'm going to be presenting at Michigan next week to the student learning analytics at Michigan. And a lot of people are starting to realize, oh, wait a minute. If you got the data, if you have a record of every badge that a school or a program issued, you know a lot about the learning that occurred. And for a lot of the kinds of informal learning environments that are using badges, you know a lot more about learning. My friends at Global Kids in New York did this lovely pilot study, and just the simple addition of badges, they knew so much more about what they were doing as a program than they did before by looking only at the badges. They were able to discover different trajectories that students were taking through the learning environment. They were finding points where students were dropping out, all this kind of stuff. But they were also able to say, yeah, we think some learning occurred here. Yeah, sure, we'll give you a random sample of badges and you can look at the evidence in the badge. So for program evaluation purposes, this is huge. I don't know if any of you have done program evaluation for informal educational programming, but it's a nightmare. It's often very difficult to do. It often turns organizations inside out. They just don't know how to do it. Some real interesting potential here. So I have proposed tentatively these categories. If you're interested, there's a blog post up about this issue that now has 40 comments. It's a lovely, lovely discussion about these issues. Why, there's Emily Conley right there. So let me break this one down a little bit. So let's just ignore the fact that badges have evidence in them, for starters. And let's just say, conventionally speaking, you've got your research of badges. Summatively, you can study the impact of badges. You can look and see what happened when you introduce badges into an existing ecosystem. You can study motivation. You can look at other learning outcomes, right? So that's a research of badges. Once you start doing that, though, you're going to probably want to start doing some research to improve your badging ecosystem, to get more students to use them. What do we have to do to get more students to push our badges out to Facebook to share them? What do we have to do to make these badges valuable? What do we have to do to make these badges more credible? So that's what I'm calling research for badges. I'm proposing a third category, though, of research for ecosystems. I'm a design-based researcher. I'm a huge fan of DBR. I think that the idea of building local theory in the context of efforts to reform practice and generating principles that travel with the contextual features that are responsible for that knowledge is a pretty good thing for education. I believe Ellen Lagerman when she said that the most scientifically valid context for building evidence for reforming schools is research that is carried out in the context of reforming schools. So I think that badges are going to be a really ripe setting for doing some really interesting DBR, especially because when we come over here, we can do those kinds of studies with the evidence contained in the badges. People are already doing this. People are manipulating the conditions under which badges are awarded and then looking at the evidence in the badges to support their hypotheses. That's different. We haven't been able to do anything like that before. So that's just beginning now. So, and I'm pretty much winding down here. One of my main findings, though, has to do with the relationship between these practices. The learning that you can recognize is really constrained by the context in which you're introducing badges. We had this a much more simplistic principle that basically if you already have existing content, the way badges are introduced are going to be very different than if you build an ecosystem around the badges. My colleague at Mozilla, Cheryl Grant, just wrote a brilliant piece where she actually broke this down into 5 different ways of thinking about introducing badges. So that's a pretty big thing for people to think about, like the way you bring badges in. Kyle's, your example is what we would call a badges first. You started with badges. No, I guess it isn't. I have to think about which one of the categories it is. We're going to talk about this. But the real point I want to make here is that the project context impacts your recognition practices. Those together impact what you can assess. Right? There's some things you know, the kind of learning you recognize really drives your assessment practices. And that recognition assessment ecosystem in turn drives your motivation practices. And then finally, all of those decisions impact what you can study. So that's a big overall finding, is this flow of influence. There's a little bit of backwards happening here. There's a little bit of proleptic work, to use the anthropological term. So, and then I'm going to come back to those ones in the middle at the end of my talk. But so this is the kind of stuff we have. So here's an example. These are the principles that are associated with supporter to reporters medals. Each of those principles has a more specific practice associated with it. Right, so we just zip through those. Right now, this information is all locked up in this incredibly cumbersome wiki-based database that we developed because we're idiots and we don't know how to develop databases. It's really cumbersome. This is the second one. We use MediaWiki, and this is TikiWiki. It works for us, but it's pretty cumbersome. This is what I mean by linking. Right now what we're doing is going through each of the principles and identifying relevant research literature so that other people who come to this information would be able to do this. So I'm taking here, this is mostly my writing, but this is partly Rebecca's area. So I'm trying to take I think Pellegrino's Knowing What Students Know NRC report is a great resource. But I have a pretty good idea of somebody who's going to approach that resource from the perspective of badges, some heads up that might be useful for them. It's a resolutely cognitivist approach to assessment, and that some of the more social assessment practices, they're not going to find them there. So that's what I mean by making this stuff relevant. This is what we're really immersed in right now. I was in Chicago last week at MacArthur planning what we're calling a National Badges Summit, which is going to be Valentine's Day weekend in February. What we're trying to do now is get this information out there. So, for example, this is the kind of stuff we have. This is Cheryl Grant's brilliance. What she's done here is posted. These are project Q&As with each of the projects. Extremely useful piece of information. Here is my post of my badges of my research design principles. And this is what I'm talking about. I know it's a long blog post. Everybody know what TLDR stands for? Too long didn't read. Not for us. So all of this is happening outside of the traditional scholarly literature. We got hammered at NCME. Like they just said, no, you're not going to talk about that here. So on the other hand, the motivation proposal for 8-year got slaughtered, but the assessment proposal they loved. So it's a very interesting thing. So we're definitely getting stuff out into the peer review, but this is all unfolding way too quickly. But this is what I'm talking about. This is really dense, detailed stuff with Bill Penuel's in there. This guy Michael Olnick is a brilliant guy in the credentialing realm. So that's 40 comments. That's some, I don't know, I like that. That's pretty exciting. We really made a lot of progress in some really thorny issues by putting this up as blog posts. So we're getting a community started. We've been asked to build a more stable and a more coherent resource to capture everything with the motivation of this big summit in June. My programmer is going to build this cool engine. I think we're going to make this work so that when people come to the website, they'll kind of tag themselves. They'll say, I'm new, I'm interested in museums, I'm a background, and then it'll recommend them some resources that are most relevant to them. So, before I wrap this up and try to blow people's minds a little bit, let me stop for questions. I've been talking for about 20 minutes straight, actually half an hour. So, questions? Yes?
Could you explain to me the bit where you're talking about badge hierarchies versus competency versus what the other structure was, which you saw organizations implementing or using the badges? Can you explain the differences between those three methods?
God, I put Andy onto that. Let me see. We're getting pretty far down in the trenches there for me. I believe, it's whether they're stacking them. I'm going to have to really think about this. That was a year ago. No, I can't. I'll just mangle it. I really have a great team, and I'm really these days especially. I have a full-time project coordinator, and they're really running things. So I'm really trying to stay up.
Do you know if they have any blog posts?
Any blog posts? Yeah, if you Google Haystack Hickey blog, there are all of those details are up there on blogs at Haystack. Yes. Great question. I can't answer it. Other questions? Yes.
I wonder if you could speak to the role you see badges potentially playing in the type of vision you have for assessment that you're outlining in the recent JLS article.
Say a little more.
Well, in particular, you note that standardized assessments are pretty good at factual recall.
Yeah.
Maybe not so good about continuity across context or
yeah, exactly.
transfer.
I'll tell you a story. We did the first Badges Summit was in Toronto at Mozilla a month and a half ago, and I pitched something to Connie Owl that got her very excited that we're chasing down. One of the things about the Common Core is that huge swaths of the Common Core are off limits for the new, or they're unmeasurable. Right? If anybody's looked at the Common Core, many of them are practices. That's why we love them. In math, it's very clear. There are these cross-cutting mathematical practices. Those don't appear on the standardized achievement measures that Smarter Balanced. And so that's a really low-hanging fruit for badges. That's a really good thing. In the English standards as well. The standards like, do something often. Well, that's not going to be on a test. But it's a really good opportunity. We at MacArthur see it as a huge opportunity. If we could set up some sort of system that would allow students to earn badges for attaining those, as far as I'm concerned, much, much more valuable things. I'm terrified of what's going to happen when they attach value added to the new Common Core test that have excluded all of the stuff that I think is important. We got a big problem on our hands, in my opinion. So I think that coming up with alternative assessments, portfolios, students being able to submit portfolios of their work. There's a lot of opportunities there for this stuff. I think that attaching badges to standardized achievement measures is generally a pretty bad idea, though. I don't see that. I think that's just let them do that stuff. So did I answer your question?
Yeah, I'd like to ask just a quick follow-up, which is, so I noticed that you're trying to provide some guidelines for how to do badges, and I'm imagining that from a situative perspective, you could make them more, relating the experience to your own context to promote that kind of broadly applicable knowledge. But I can also imagine people doing it quite badly. Is that?
I'll share that with a story. When Connie Owl was introducing the badges talk, when she did this kickoff meeting last Friday in Chicago. She told me a story that I thought I had heard all of her stories about badges, but I hadn't heard this one. She said that when she was starting the reason that she jumped on badges the way she did is one of the things I did not uncover when I mean, Gates Foundation is so huge. There are really multiple foundations. So the person that I interviewed had no knowledge of badges and wasn't, she was the head of one of the major education divisions. But she said, I heard that, I don't remember the guy's name, he's a big guy at Gates. He said, I heard he was interested in badges, and everything he gets interested in, he F's it up. Small schools, right? So the biggest fear is that people were going to go all in, require people to do formal evaluations before they even know how to use them, and then they'd say, they don't work. So big push to say, let's just, I think I diverted from your question, though.
So is that why the guidelines that you're developing, I mean, is this...
Oh, yeah. So let me I'm backtrack. So one of the things we're doing is developing these are called working examples. I don't know if anybody's heard of this. They're these multimedia artifacts that are easy to create. So what you see here is here's the supporter to a reporter working example, and here's the assessment principles working example. So if you're an assessment guy and you're interested in badges, you're going to start here, but you're going to get to one of those principles and you're going to say, that's interesting. They had 4 different projects that use portfolio assessment. Click over here. So that's the big thing we're trying to do, is this intensive cross-linking. One of my real goals around the research is I want somebody to start reading something and go, blah, 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 blah. They get lost. They don't have enough experience to make sense of one of the resources we get. But it's up there so that when they do get more experience, they know where to go to find it. So we're obsessing about that very issue right now. Ask me a year from now, I think I'll be able to point to some success.
Do you have a sense of how young you can go in terms of,
Absolutely.
When do kids...
13.
13.
Yeah, COPA. So the badges are off limits for anybody under 13 because of the children's online privacy. We have to deal with COPA with kids under 13, and then once you get into a higher education institution, you have to deal with FERPA.
So that's sort of the legal issues. Let's say we remove the legal issues. I'm really talking about the cognitive issues or the situation issues. It's sort of like the
Well, Mozilla has some brilliant attorneys who have been all over this. It's a big problem. I mean, the privacy issue. That's why there's no name in a badge. It's only an email address. I can put names on my site, but there is no metadata field for name for the privacy purpose.
And more fundamentally, let's say I was doing a course for little kids, and there was no one in that universe except the little kids themselves and me. Could they evaluate each other for badges at the age of 6 and 7? I'm looking at the peer assessment component. What's your sense of that? I'm just trying to see, in the big picture.
Yeah. That's a really good question. No, I think that. Kids. I mean, when you see kids 2-year-olds on airplanes with iPads. The kid in the airport last week was like, "My iPad, you know how kids scream at their parents in airports. The kid was screaming, bellowing for her iPad. They get it. I mean, I think that they we did a hack jam this summer, teaching using Hackosaurus, which is this cool tool that Mozilla developed. You mouse over any web page and it reveals the underlying HTML, and it's really cool. You teach kids how to hack the newspaper and rewrite the front page of the local newspaper with stories about their friends or superheroes or whatever. And we had some pretty young kids in there, so we didn't push those badges out. They got it, though. They really liked getting them. And, we would walk around and issue the badges with a cell phone. So we would walk up and we would take their picture, either of their screen or them or both, and that would be the evidence in the badge, and they could have that. Now, that would sit within the badge site we were using. Now, if they choose to push that out to Facebook, which would then invoke COPA, that's obviously a risk. I mean, you're supposed to be 13 to use Facebook, right?
Yeah.
So, I don't know, did I answer? Did that get at the issue? What's our time?
We had it actually, I think
Are we out of time?
we're officially out of time.
Okay, let me wrap up here with one last thing then. So, one of my blog posts at Haystack is advancing this notion of the transformative and the transcendent functions of digital badges. I think it's possible that badges are going to be so transformative that they are going to allow some and force others to transcend sort of a lot of conventions in education. I don't know, but I'm just saying, maybe. if badges transform credentialing, will recognition of learning be crowdsourced? Will it become more important? How many of you, are any coders in here? Anybody know what Stack Overflow is? Do you use it?
Yes.
So, right, so do you have badges at Stack Overflow?
I know.
Oh, but you go there to ask questions and stuff, right? So the back end of Stack Overflow is an employment agency. People pay it's like $10,000 or something. Because if you want to know who knows, I'm just making this up, so correct me if I'm wrong, who knows power-saving tricks in the Android platform, you go to Stack Overflow. You don't know who the person is. And they earn these badges, right? So it's credible, right? If you want to know if people know stuff, and if we just scale up Stack Overflow to learning more broadly, I don't know, it's happened pretty quickly with Stack Overflow, so it's promising to happen in a lot of other domains. So our traditional ways of thinking about credibility and accountability, we might have to rethink them. Likewise, when we get to assessment, I'll return to this one, so I'll cut that one short. I've been arguing for about 15 years now that this debate between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, which is rooted in a fundamental epistemological difference about what it means to learn, it's just tired and it's just getting in the way. And that if we take newer situative perspectives, engage participation, for example, and treat those as different special cases, so to speak, of more situated forms of motivation, you come up with a lot of practical solutions around this sort of nag. I mean, we've been debating this thing for 30 years. Come on. Now nobody's even listening to us. So we really need some new ways of thinking about stuff like motivation. And I think that badges, I'm finding much more traction with my arguments about motivation in the badging community than I ever found in the academic research community. And if they badges, will they transform research method, right? So do we really need randomized clinical trials of digital badges to prove they work? But by the time badges are working, by the time we know how to make them work, we won't need proof. I mean, there aren't any randomized clinical trials of supporting grades, and yet people still say, what's the evidence these badges work? Well, what's the evidence grades work? They just are. So let me come back and finish with this discussion of credibility and validity. So I'm a measurement guy, right? I've been teaching. I love this Popham's book now. The 2013 edition has a blonde kid on the cover. The last edition, everybody was generic, multi-ethnic. The one before there was the African-American elementary school teacher, right? So you can see the cover of the book changing to reflect the sort of broader political morals. And I've been teaching it long enough to see that evolve and to see Popham's evolving views on stuff like validity and motivation. And his changing, like he's now starting to say, consequences, it's not part of validity, but it matters a lot more in 2014 than it did in 2010. But nonetheless, he's still sticking to content, criteria, and construct-related aspects of validity. And that's what I teach my students in my class, although I published one article where I use Messick's divisions, right? So I'm a measurement guy, right? So Carla writes this blog post, and she says, credibility is really what matters. I said, credibility? Come on, it says it right here in my textbook. That is an unsanctioned form. That's face validity. It's unsanctioned. And then I read her post, and I thought more and more, she's right. She's right. If my leader badges in my class, like let's say somebody pranks that recognition system in my class. Let's imagine they pay people to endorse them because they really want that badge. The credibility of that badge immediately plummets. So the credibility really does get crowdsourced. If people don't think a badge is credible evidence of something, it doesn't matter whether we've documented content, substantive, structural, generalizable, external, and consequential aspects of validity. It matters what the community thinks about that. So she pointed to B.J. Fogg. This guy's pretty interesting. He's at Stanford. He talks a lot about motivation too. And so he's proposing these different categories, this taxonomy of credibility. And I honestly think that going forward, if we want to look at credibility in digital badges, I think we're going to make a lot more progress in building ecosystems that really are transformative and productive if we think about his categories. I don't even know what to do with structural aspects of validity. in thinking about validating these badges. So I'll leave with that note. This is what I mean by the transcendent potential of badges. We'll see. I'm not certain. Karen Cater, the former head of educational technology and now the head of Digital Promise, was at the meeting last Friday. I think that's a pretty good sign. Gates was there. I don't think they're going away. I think they're going to stick around. And if they do, we're going to need to think about things like recognition practices, credentialing, motivation, assessment, research. We're going to have to think about them differently than we've been thinking about them. Thank you.
Friendship, may she never lack.